Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Plastic Podcast, the show that tells the story of plastic, how we got here, where we are, and where we need to go. My name is Clark Marchese, your host, and this week we are serving science yet again. Can you believe? And the topic for today is biodegradable plastic. So, biodegradable plastics. I remember the very first time I used a biodegradable plastic. It was in 2018, and I remember that day very well. Not necessarily because of the plastic, but I was at a Rekorderlig cider festival. Rekorderlig, for those of you who might not know, is a Swedish cider brand with a bunch of amazing flavors. They have apple, obviously, but they also have strawberry lime, wild berries, passion fruit, and some that they call botanicals, where they add herbs such as peach, basil, rhubarb, lemon, mint, raspberry, hibiscus, rose. I literally tried every flavor that they had available that day. Anyways, the cup I was using had a special message on it, and I took a picture, so I do remember exactly what it says. It said, "I am not a plastic cup. 100% compostable, 100% biodegradable. This tumbler is made from plant starch and can be turned into compost." Now, at the time, I was a student in environmental studies, and I thought, oh my God, we did it. The oceans, they're saved. I looked into it a bit after that, and I found that there were some companies that have started making plastic out of avocado pits, sugarcane, bamboo, corn. And when I first had the idea for this episode, I thought I was going to learn how to make a cup out of a corn. But when I started looking into it, it seems that there is a growing body of scientific research pointing out that these might not be the solution that we thought they would. And the direction for the episode took a little turn. Today, we are going to be talking about greenwashing. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, I phoned a friend, Merriam-Webster, and I got an official definition, which is as follows. Greenwashing, the act or practice of making a product, policy, activity, etc., appear to be more environmentally friendly or less environmentally damaging than it really is. And it seems that this is a major issue when it comes to biodegradable plastics. Now, I have a wonderful guest today to talk to us all about that. But before we start, we're going to have a couple definitions and a little history lesson. Bioplastics and biodegradable plastics. Our guest will help us define them in more technical terms, but basically, a bioplastic is a plastic that was made out of something coming from nature, a naturally occurring source. As we learned in our episode on the history of plastic, some of the earliest plastics were made from cellulose, which comes from plants, so that would be a bioplastic. Now, this is in contrast to most conventional plastics, which we know are made from fossil fuels. Even though, yes, I know a fossil fuel is just a dinosaur and some leaves like seriously smushed together. But this is the term we use to separate them. Biodegradable, on the other hand, basically just means it breaks down and decomposes. We will have a more technical definition later. Now for the history lesson. One of the earliest forms of biodegradable plastic was made from milk. Casein, more specifically. In 1897, it was called Galalith. Now the problem with Galalith was that it didn't retain its shape super well, and so it wasn't very functional. The next development we have comes from a French researcher named Maurice Lemoine in 1926. He created the first biodegradable plastic made of bacteria, which was called Bacillus magaterium. What he was trying to do with it, I'm not sure. The internet only tells me that his research was overlooked. At the time, the applications for a development like that were not so lucrative. They became lucrative in the 1970s. Why? This one I do know the answer to. It was because during the 1970s oil crisis, when prices of oil skyrocketed, and, as we know, most plastics are made from fossil fuel companies were worried that access to oil would remain unstable and unpredictable. The industry started to invest in other potential sources. Additionally, in the 1990s, the medical community was hopeful about biodegradable plastics as well. Say you break your leg and you need a screw or a plate to help your bone put itself back together. The medical community was hoping to come up with a product that would just dissolve once your body fixed itself. So medical companies started to invest in these solutions as well. Finally, if we are following the money, we haven't talked about it a lot on the show yet, but plastic waste was gaining more and more attention from environmentalists starting in the 1990s. So the search for sustainable alternatives to conventional plastics also accelerated research into its development. And now we see them a lot more often. biodegradable trash bags and cups, all being presented as the environmentally conscious alternative. As it turns out, however, science is finding that the consequences of biodegradable plastics almost mirror the consequences we see with conventional plastics, and the benefits they have to offer us are both limited and only seen in very specific, intentional contexts, at least at this stage. And that is the main topic of our show today. The scientist I found that explained this to me is named Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones. Winnie obtained a PhD looking into microplastics in the deep sea ecosystem and is currently working as a postdoc researcher in environmental biology at the International Research Unit for Marine Litter at the University of Plymouth, where she specifically looks into the consequences of biodegradable plastics on the environment. Winnie explained to me what a biodegradable plastic is, the different ways they impact the environment and their social and economic impacts, and how all of these compare to conventional plastics. We also talked about the upcoming United Nations Treaty on Plastic Pollution, how biodegradable plastics should make their way into that document, and how you can stay up to date on the process of negotiations. I hope you have as much fun learning about this as I did, and let's get started. All right, welcome, Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones. I want to thank you so much for giving your time and coming on to the Plastic Podcast today. The first question would just be if you could introduce yourself for us.
Yeah, of course. So I'm an environmental biologist and plastic pollution scientist, and currently my role is researching the fate and impacts of biodegradable plastics. So I've been researching plastic pollution for about the last 9 years or so, in a number of different sort of topics. My research broadly focuses on environmental fate and quantities of plastics and microplastics, how they move from land to sea, the effects of those to both marine and terrestrial organisms and ecosystems, and then ultimately trying to develop science to inform solutions. So within biodegradable plastics, currently I'm looking at the impacts of those on terrestrial ecosystems, plants and animals and soils as well.
Okay, I want to ask lots of questions about that, but before we get into it, I'm wondering what made you interested in studying plastics in the first place, and why did you ultimately decide to become a researcher?
Yeah, I guess my journey in some ways was traditional. I finished school, went to university to study zoology, went on then to do a master's degree in marine biology. But after that, I moved out to Belize in the Caribbean to work for an NGO. And our field camp was based on this small remote island with very few people in the surrounding. Yet, with every tide that came in, plastic would also be washed onto our little beach. Of course, we'd collect this, but without waste management on the island, there was very little we could do to sort of safely or adequately dispose of that. And I spent a year working there and increasingly became curious about studying plastics and where all this litter was actually coming from. And during my master's, I studied a module where we could write about any form of marine pollutant of our choosing. And primarily to be different from everyone else on my course, I actually chose plastic pollution because everyone else was choosing, climate change or oil spills or things like that. And when I started to dig in about plastics, I was surprised how many questions there were still left that had been unanswered. And I think this is 2012, 2013. So yeah, quite a while ago. So I had that in the back of my mind. And then obviously seeing that plastic in the Caribbean. So when I returned, I was kind of motivated to study this and went on then to do a PhD studying plastic pollution actually in the deep sea ecosystem, looking at current quantities that were there and also the historic occurrence of plastics in the deep sea.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think also as I'm sort of doing this project and approaching this subject as a journalist, I'm also finding out how many questions that we still don't exactly have the answers to. But I think also I've talked to a handful of researchers who are studying plastics at this point, and it's actually sort of a common story that through field work, they weren't expecting to encounter plastics or plastic wasn't exactly the focus of their field research in the beginning. And then they see it around them and then it kind of prompts a shift in focus. So I think there's something really powerful about seeing it right in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about some definitions. Waste is obviously a major problem when it comes to plastic because it doesn't break down or degrade like other organic materials do, and we see a host of consequences as a result of that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but a biodegradable plastic is basically something that serves the same function as a regular plastic but does degrade like other organic materials. At least that's the way that they're presented to us as laypersons and consumers. So is that correct?
Yeah, kind of. So a plastic is a synthetic polymer, so a really long chain of carbon. And that carbon can either come from fossil-based sources like oil, non-renewable resources, or bio-based sources like animals, plants, bacteria, so a renewable source. So biodegradable plastics can actually be made of either. So just because it's called a biodegradable plastic, it doesn't mean that it's come from a bio-based source of carbon. So it could be made of fossil carbon, fossil resources, oil, or it could be from plant material, or it could actually be a mix of both.
Okay, I learned my first thing today. I did not know that biodegradable plastics could also be made of fossil fuels.
But what's really key about it is that it is able to undergo this process of biodegradation. And what that means is microbes are able to break that plastic down into its molecules, so into carbon dioxide, into minerals, into water. So that's the really key component. But the rate that happens is really dependent on the material, so the properties of that plastic, its chemical structure, the additives that are put into it, the chemicals that can sometimes make it more resistant to degradation, and also the environment in which it, used or where it ends up. So the temperature and the pH, the types of microorganisms that are actually in that environment. So something that is biodegradable in soil may not also be biodegradable in marine water or fresh water, or even buried deep within the soil. Maybe it just needs to be on the soil surface. It's quite a variable thing. Just saying biodegradable certainly doesn't mean that this plastic is universally degradable in all conditions, all environments, and even under what sort of timescale.
Okay, wow. So in summary, not all biodegradable plastics are made from renewable resources, and not all biodegradable plastics degrade in the same way, at the same rate, or under the same circumstances. Now, a lot of the things that you just told us have implications for plastic waste, but I want to kind of start at the beginning of the chain of production and work our way forward from there. Is there a difference on the impact to the environment from the production of biodegradable plastics versus conventional plastics?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, in terms of the production of those, it's not necessarily synonymous that a biodegradable plastic means that it's environmentally friendly or sustainable or any of those sort of buzzwords that are used. There's very little testing of the environmental credentials of these materials to know whether they are actually better or worse. Of course, those plastics made from fossil-based sources are coming from a non-renewable finite resource, oil. We've only got so much of that, and it's also used for so many other purposes. But then when we think about bio-based materials, if we're using land to grow plants to then turn into plastic, is that the best use of water, of space, of land? There's also pressures from producing enough food to support the human population. So both have their challenges. And ultimately, the primary solution is just cut down the use of all plastic, regardless of where it comes from. We've also got additives, chemicals being added into the polymer as it's being made, regardless of whether that carbon is bio-based or fossil-based. There's still a suite of chemicals. I think there's about 13,000 registered chemicals that are used in all plastics. So not just one single plastic product, but if we look at all of the types of plastic. So there's a huge amount of chemicals that go into the production of plastics.
Do we know what percentage of biodegradable plastics are made from each source, fossil versus bio-based?
Again, that's quite a complicated thing. One of the most widely used bio-based biodegradable plastics is called PLA. that's used in a range of things, including tea bags, to-go food packaging, agricultural products, and that's derived from plant material. In 2022, nearly 500,000 metric tons were produced just of that polymer alone. But another very widely used biodegradable polymer called PBAT is actually derived from fossil fuel resources. It's quite hard to get the information of the breakdown of what percentage is bio-based and what percentage is fossil-based, but certainly both are used.
Okay, so I did a bit of looking into this, and Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones is right that it would be perhaps almost even impossible to know how much of each type is produced if we look at a metric such as, metric tons, for example. But we can see how much money each industry is making. So we have PLA, polylactide, and we have PBAT, which is butylene adipate co-terephthalate. Boom. PLA is the kind made of biomaterials, and PBAT is made from fossil fuels. Now, according to a market report by Brainy Insights, I found that PLA, the biomaterial kind, raked in $500 million in 2022. I also found in Emergent Research Industry Report that PBAT, the fossil fuel kind, generated around $1.46 billion, so about 3 times as much. I also found that both types are projected to more than double their revenues in the next 10 years or so production of both is definitely increasing full steam ahead. A lot of people think that biodegradable plastics are a magic solution for all of plastic pollution, and it sounds like that's not exactly the case. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about why it's presented this way? Do you think people just get so excited because we're hopeful and looking for solutions, and we just sort of ran away with it before we took the time to actually investigate it the way it needed it to be investigated? Or is it maybe even something more sinister than that? What are your thoughts on why biodegradable plastics are sort of seen as this magic solution?
Yeah, good question. It is very confusing, the terminology. You've got, so many different labels on things: plant-based, bio-based, I'm not plastic, biodegradable. It's really hard for the consumer to know. And there's no standards around that. So, it's not necessarily the industry intentionally confusing the consumer, but if there were clear labeling standards and terminology, I think it would definitely help us as the consumers to know what it is that we're buying and also how to dispose of it. And there's some research that shows consumers who use biodegradable options, well, firstly, they're more likely to go for something termed plant-based, biodegradable over a conventional plastic. Also, they're...
Okay, we lost our internet for half a second during the interview, but she was explaining that people who use biodegradable plastics are less likely to worry where their trash ends up and even to litter.
Because they think it will just biodegrade in the environment. Why are they increased in their use? I think it is partly people just hoping for these solutions, but there is also a lack of testing of these materials. So it does appear to me that it is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction without necessarily the appropriate testing in place to know whether or not they are better, what the effects on the environment are, what the effects on animals, what the effects on us are of being exposed to these plastics.
Okay, I want to start to talk about how they specifically are impacting the environment, but before we do, I have to ask, and perhaps the answer isn't clear, can we confidently say that while we do need to ultimately reduce plastic use overall, for the time being, bioplastics or biodegradable plastics are a better option? Or can we not confidently say that?
I think in very specific applications, biodegradables may offer advantages to conventional plastics, but that isn't for a lot of the purposes they're being used for now. So not for to-go food containers, not for these sort of single-use plastics, plastic bottles, to-go food packaging, but for applications where they are used in the environment and they remain in the environment. So actually agricultural practices, you see these films laying on the ground that crops grow through. At the end of the season, they're quite degraded and they are sort of ploughed back into the soil. So there, a biodegradable plastic, if it actually biodegrades, does offer an advantage over a conventional plastic, which might be very hard to remove from the soil and might have fragmented into small pieces. So in particular applications, yes, there might be benefits as long as it actually biodegrades and doesn't release harmful chemicals. But for just substituting all plastics, no.
Okay. What strikes me about that example you gave is that you can sort of oversee the entire process of where the plastic is going and exactly the environment that it's degrading in, which is not the case when we put something into our bin. It can end up, we have no idea really most of the time. So that sort of leads us into the way that biodegradable plastics affect the environment when they turn into just plastic waste out there in the world. How do they affect the environment compared to traditional plastics?
They actually have quite similar effects. So this number of studies on biodegradable plastics is much smaller, much lower than the number of studies looking at conventional plastics. It's only been in recent years that we've shifted some focus and started to study biodegradable plastics more. But in terms of the conventional plastics, we know that they do cause harm to organisms through the physical particles being in the digestive system of animals, through changes to the metabolism affecting their reproduction, altering the environment, so the physical characteristics of that environment. But we see similar effects for biodegradable plastics. I've just been conducting some work with earthworms, which are vital in terms of processing organic nutrients from the soil surface down into the deeper layers. Yeah, really, really vital within that ecosystem. And some of the biodegradable plastics that we've been exposing these worms to have altered their reproduction, meaning they produce less offspring over their life. We've also seen that it can disrupt their behavior, so the amount that they're burrowing.
So we are going to do an episode just on plastics in the soil, so stick around for that if you want to learn more about earthworms. And also, yes, I would still love all of you listening if you were worms.
But it can also alter the physical properties of the soil, so how much that soil is able to hold water. As the climate's changing, we're seeing more extreme weather. Certainly in the UK in the last few years, we've had much more profound drought and then torrential downpours of rain. So we've had droughts and then we've had extreme flooding. If the soil is not able to hold as much water because of the use of these plastics, that affects the water dynamics. We're actually going to see more of soil erosion and more flooding, more extreme flooding when we have these rainfall events. So what might sound like a small impact, like, oh, the plastic can alter the properties of the soil, can actually have quite profound ecosystem-wide effects. But of course, we do need to keep on researching biodegradable plastics to fully understand what effect they have. But certainly the evidence that we've got so far indicates similar effects to conventional plastics. And of course, the chemicals that I mentioned at the beginning, we see these in the biodegradable plastics too, and there's work from other research groups across the world showing that the chemicals contained within biodegradable plastics can in some cases have greater effects than the chemicals leaching from conventional plastics. And that might be because the biodegradables are designed to degrade quicker and so release these chemicals faster. And it might be because there's also more chemicals in them because we need the plastics to function for a defined period, and then we need them to biodegrade. So you might have to add more chemicals in to make sure that that plastic can still have its function before it then deteriorates.
What about microplastics, which are increasingly being brought up in the news? Do these biodegradable plastics also shed fragments and fibers into the environment the same way conventional plastics do?
They can. And there's another whole category of plastics called oxodegradables. They've been banned through much of Europe because they are a polythene, a conventional plastic, with just an additive put into them that makes them fragment into microplastics and over a quicker timescale. So when you look with your eyes, you don't see the plastic, but it's still there. It's just in a microscopic form.
Okay, so I did a bit of looking into these, and it seems that the key distinction here is that there's a difference between something that simply breaks down and actual nutrient recycling. So when a banana breaks down in the environment, for example, as it rots, everything that it was is being reused by the soil, by the microbes in the soil, by the bacteria, and they're taking its nutrients and turning it into something else that's useful. The environment doesn't really know what to do when it sees plastic. So these oxo-degradables have no benefits compared to traditional plastics just because they disappear from our sight. They have been banned in a lot of places, which it's interesting how we can get around banning one but not the other. But in any case, the EU has banned these oxo-degradables in a 2019 directive. Incidentally, this decision was challenged through a lawsuit by a company called Symphony Environmental, and their tagline is "Making Plastic Smarter." Now, I'm not too familiar with everything that this company produces, but we've got to be careful about company branding in cases of greenwashing like this. Now, science tells us, and ultimately so did the General Court of the EU when they ruled against Symphony Environmental, that oxo-degradables are not making plastics smarter.
These have been recognised to be very damaging and, as I said, banned in certain countries. But we're seeing an increase in their use in the global south. There's a misinformation surrounding what they will do. There's a mismarketing of these products as truly biodegradable when they're actually not. To answer your question, yes, they can fragment into microplastics.
That sort of leads me into my next question. What are the social and economic considerations to bear in mind when it comes to biodegradable plastics?
Yeah, absolutely. All types of plastics, biodegradable or not, it's such a multifaceted issue. And it does really require this entire life cycle approach. By that, I mean, analysing the production all the way from the extraction of that carbon source right through to the manufacturing and the transport, the use, and finally the disposal of plastics. So we need to adequately have multiple sectors, scientists from all disciplines, policymakers, public sector, for example, coming together. We spoke briefly about the land use required to grow the crops to turn into plastic, but there's also environmental justice issues. A lot of these might be grown in global south, where there's a lot of monocropping or deforestation to provide the land resources to grow these. So, the issue surrounding plastic isn't just an environmental issue, it's a human rights issue as well.
Okay, so it makes sense that if the environmental and scientific implications of traditional plastics and alternative plastics are almost the same, the social and economic issues will be the same as well. But what I'm also hearing is that it might even pose the potential for heightened harm if the true environmental impacts of these products are concealed through greenwashing, and countries without regulation as effective as the EU sort of go full steam ahead with these new methods, we'll say. So what are we going to do about this? I want to switch a little bit to talk about the United Nations Treaty on Plastic Pollution, which I understand you are involved in some information campaigns and advocacy for. Can you tell us about this treaty and, what is it?
Yeah, so in 2021, 175 nations agreement on plastic pollution by the end of this year. This is really sort of a landmark, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to develop a high ambition treaty to end plastic pollution. There's an amazing group of scientists, the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty, which is a network of over 300 scientists that give up their time. They're all independent, so we're unbiased, and we just provide evidence, scientific, robust evidence that hopefully will support the negotiations.
Okay, and you say they're going to reach an agreement this year in 2024.
It's meant to come into effect at the end of this year. In reality, I'm not sure. We've still got a ways to go. There was a provisional text to start working against. Nations all submitted their revised changes to that, what they wanted the text to reflect. And with 170 or so nations submitting text. It's now the job to go through that and try and see what the path will be.
Do biodegradable plastics find their way into this document at all? If they do, are we satisfied with their position? And if they don't find their way into the document, what do you think absolutely needs to be addressed?
So they do come into the text. They're not specifically named, but they do come in as this term, quote unquote, plastic alternatives and substitutes. So at the moment, everything's in brackets, which means that it hasn't been agreed on there. All the text is as a suggested form. So all of us scientists are watching this space and working very hard within the Scientists Coalition to try and make some recommendations for the path ahead in terms of the essential use of different plastics, the transparency of how they're used and how they're produced, to just name a few, as well as obviously making sure that there's safety criteria. There still needs to be regulation on the chemicals, making sure that the timescales in which they biodegrade and making sure that the labels are in place.
Is there any way that listeners or the average person who's curious can either follow along with how this process unfolds or get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. The Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty has a website, and we produce very short, maximum 2-page summaries about a range of topics. They're very accessible to read. So I co-authored one on biodegradable and bio-based plastics, these alternatives. So there's a very short summary of pros and cons and where they might have applications listeners could read about. But there's a range of topics, the interaction with plastics and human rights, and the interaction of plastics with climate change are all on there. So there's a very good resource. To follow the actual treaty negotiations themselves, this is all through the UN. And you can actually watch along and review the documents if you're so inclined to by going to the UN website. Some are quite dense, but there are summaries that are produced. Also, actually, the Scientists Coalition has a LinkedIn page where when those negotiations are taking place, we're posting daily summaries that you can read along with. So the next one is in April, as I said. So through April, there'll be more activity following along with those negotiations.
Okay, guess what, guys? It is April now. So you can find a link in the episode description to all of the things that Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones just mentioned. Okay, we are going to start to wrap up the episode. And one of the questions I like to ask before we close out is there one piece of good news that has come out recently in your field that you can share with us?
This is actually quite tricky to answer. Good news. Yeah, we have seen a lot of different bans of single-use plastic items all around the world. And these are great, but they don't go far enough. It's like sticking a plaster on a broken leg and expecting it to heal. They're a good start, but we really need things to go further than just bans of specific items. But what I think is the good news is that the world is really sitting up and listening and aware of the wide-scale impacts and prevalence of plastic in the environment. And there is a public pressure, and there's a science pressure, there's a industry pressure to action, a call to action, and eyes looking at governments to make ambitious and effective decisions to actually create meaningful, positive change as we go forwards.
I would say that counts as good news. I think that counts. And I think this treaty that we've talked about presents the opportunity for good news in the coming years. So I think we can go with this. The second question is, what is your favorite part of your job?
So I love working with students. I mean, I undertake a lot of research myself, but I also supervise research projects run by undergraduates and postgraduate students at the university. I really enjoy working with them, seeing their energy, seeing them progress. These are the next scientists, the next leaders. So it's amazing sort of seeing their journey and then seeing what they go on to as well, and keeping in touch after their university journey has finished. I think my second favourite thing is contributing science that can be used to support our policy decisions. The research that we're conducting does have implications for how these plastics are used and the decisions that we make.
I think both of those also kind of count as good news.
Yeah.
The last question is there anything that we did not discuss today that you think is important to mention when we talk about biodegradable plastics?
Ultimately, the best option is to stop consuming as many resources regardless of what plastic they are. This isn't specifically about biodegradable, but I would just sort of like to flag this in the broader plastic context and discussion. Just want to extend a little bit of caution about products claiming that they might be made of ocean-bound plastic, or, that they've been stopped going into the environment by being turned into shoes or clothing or a bag, something like that. Ultimately, a lot of this is just a marketing strategy for us to buy more, as scientifically there's no such thing as ocean-bound plastic. Or
I don't think I understand what that means.
Yeah, so companies are starting to brand this, that by making this product, they've intervened and stopped the plastic that was destined to go out into the ocean from actually going into the ocean. So by creating this product, they're doing almost a public service. They're preventing pollution. And that doesn't stack up. That's just not accurate scientifically. These just aren't the answer.
Got it. Thank you for explaining that to me. I hadn't heard about that, but I'm going to do some digging because that sounds suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I learned a lot, and we'll definitely keep following your work and the plastic treaty as it continues to be negotiated. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the time. It was wonderful talking to you.
All right, that was Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones, everybody. I learned a lot from this conversation, although it was not the conversation I was expecting to have when I wanted to learn more about biodegradable plastics. I wish I could tell you that we can, in fact, make a cup from a corn and all of our problems would be solved, but I don't think that this episode is a total bummer. I think that there is some things to be happy with. First of all, let's take a minute to appreciate the scientists like Dr. Winnie Courtene-Jones working on this. Part of the reason we are facing so many problems with plastics is because their true effects were not known until we had already adopted them into every part of our lives, basically. It is good that we're catching this relatively early on in the widespread application of these alternative plastics. I also think it's encouraging that we've already seen some bans on these products. We need more, but each one we get, we can point to as precedent. Lastly, I think we can find optimism in the upcoming UN treaty. If we execute this correctly, I think it's a really rare opportunity to address some of the international and global consequences that come from regional legislation. All right, I will leave it there today, but please come back again next week to learn more about our plastic planet. Thank you for listening to Plastic Podcast. You can find more information about this week's guest and links to their work in the episode description. Join us back here next week where we will be talking to an art historian from Greece named Ioannis Soumas, all about the history of our artistic relationship with plastic. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Tadeo Cabejos. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced, written, and engineered by me. If you loved it, I will not only see you here next week, but I would really appreciate a 5-star rating and review. Plastic Podcast is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. You can find more information about them in the episode description as well, or at pineforestpods.com. We've got some exciting science podcasts coming out this year, and that review I was talking about really helps the entire network to grow. All right, thank you so much to all of you who have made it this far, and we'll talk soon.